Hello, welcome beautiful people to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to this week's episode regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who's one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emilie.
Hello, Olga. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too. And welcome to the show, Wendy Harrison. So glad you can join us today.
Thank you, Olga. I'm very happy to be here.
For those who may not know Wendy, she is running on the Democratic ticket for the Windham County Senator. And she has a long history with government administration, including and I'm sorry about this, Wendy. I don't remember when it was town manager and when it was town administrator, but you've worked in Rockingham, Vernon, and Winooski?
And Winooski, yes. It was town manager in municipal manager, I should say, in Rockingham and Bellows Falls, because it's actually two communities who are served, and then town administrator in Vernon and city manager in Winooski.
Thank you. Yeah, to me, that is quite a resume. Those are three very different communities to have your fingers in as you're helping them through their municipal work. And it made me wonder, because you hold a master's in government administration, and this has really been so much of a focus of your life. What made you want to leap from a position where, for all intents and purposes, is a very hands-on kind of the doing part of municipal government to the policy-making side of state government? What kind of inspired that leap?
Right, that's a really good question, and I've made that transition before. And I really like both roles. You're right. When you're the manager, you're responsible for the entire organization. And it's a 24-hour-a-day job, especially in a larger city and sometimes in a smaller town, depending on what's happening. The reason I want now to go to the state level is because of the impact that the state has on local governments as well as people. I was previously elected to a town council for a town that had a population of 60,000. So I've dealt with electoral politics. This is the first time I've been involved in party politics. So that's new for me. But the state, particularly Vermont being a Dillon's Rule state, as I think we're going to talk about later, has a very large impact on what local residents can do, both as part of the government and just in their daily lives, which is why I want to be involved.
Is there, we've talked about local on this show, we tend to shorthand it and just call it local control, that issue about the Dillon Rule state. And just quickly for listeners, if you're new to this issue, basically in very, very, very broad strokes, being a Dillon's Rule state means that most of the power kind of sits with the state, and the state tells municipalities what they can and cannot do. Where if it was a home rule state, which is the other very broad strokes, the power tends to be reversed. And those are kind of very broad distinctions between the two. And Emilie?
If listeners want to go for a deeper dive on some past conversations about that, I think we've talked to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns about that. And we've talked to former town manager in Brattleboro and slightly awkwardly but wonderfully Wendy's husband, Peter Elwell, about those issues on past episodes. I think that was like 2 years ago, though, if people want to go deep into the Wayback Machine.
I will try to wrestle those up and link them in the show notes.
That's a great idea. And another very general way to think about it is, in a Dillon's Rule state, the state tells towns what they can do And if something is not on that list, they cannot do it. In a home
Mm-hmm.
rule state, the state gives you a list of what you cannot do. And so then you have some creativity within those boundaries.
Okay, thank you. I like that shorthand way to think about it. Were there any, for you, as when you were working as a city manager or town manager, were there ways in your daily working that local control showed up a lot?
Oh, sure. Especially during the COVID crisis, because I was in those three towns, because I was an interim manager in the second two. We had we got to experience COVID in all of my situations, so that was interesting. So yes, a very small example, relatively small, was something like dog licenses, because the state strictly tells towns the schedule of dog licenses, that the towns couldn't change those even though town hall was closed. So that's a fairly minor example, but it's something that people can relate to. A more significant example, and this gets into the weeds, so I won't go into detail, is that in development review, which is really important now when we need to build more housing, and we need to build it in the right place, and we need to build it so that it's accessible to folks. There's a lot of state control over development. And some state control is, I believe, necessary and should be there. But the system can certainly be adjusted so that developments can happen more quickly and more easily and less expensively.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. Curious, it's funny, I haven't asked this question before in conversations around local control, but I'll punt it to you. In a small state like Vermont, where we so often wrestle with issues around economy of scale, can a Dillon rule actually serve Vermont in that kind of that vein of economies for scale? If with all the different municipalities, does it just make things easier in a way? Like, what would be the benefits? I guess I'm kind of like wrestling.
Right. Well, you have to have some state control because you have to make sure that municipalities are operating within the Constitution. That's I mean that's a fundamental value. When you talk about economies of scale, then that's more of an operational question, I think, and it's a good point. If the state could do more, for example, bulk purchasing, that would be really helpful. There is some bulk purchasing with vehicles, which is good, and that's an example where it is helpful. But it doesn't have to be mandated to towns. That should be something that is available to towns. And the state does have bulk purchasing of sand, road sand, which is good. And that's something I would actually like the state to do more of, and to provide services, especially services to the tiny towns. Because it's really hard when you have volunteers who are managing all the operations of the town, because they still have to do all the town functions, even if there are only 3 of them. So if the state could, or the state doesn't necessarily have to do it itself, but if it could encourage like IT services, for example, that would be tremendous. That kind of thing is really hard for small towns.
Yeah.
To take care of.
And if you do end up being elected and going to the Senate, where in the pathways of local control, or how local control is or is not practiced in Vermont now, like, is there policy that you would like to enact or see enacted, or current policy you'd like to change that would make things easier for municipalities to do their conduct their business?
Right. This might be more of a question for Emilie, there are some places in statute where the responsibilities are clear. There are other things, like, for example, when the state in some cases sends out grant opportunities to towns, which is wonderful. Sometimes they'll just give us six weeks to turn it around, and that's not enough. So I wouldn't suggest that would go into statute, but something, an encouragement to the governor, I would think, to generally provide more time for towns to be able to turn around grant requests. That would be helpful.
I also think there's a lot in the small town local control challenges that could really benefit from some serious rethinking. So consistency from town to town can become really problematic if everyone is trying to solve this problem, trying to solve a problem on their own with the very limited resources that Wendy described. Especially given the historic emphasis we have on volunteerism and what people's capacity is for that volunteerism at this point. And so, we have really inconsistent enforcement of laws. We have really inconsistent enforcement of rules, which really points to some challenges with, our larger justice system and fairness in our state. And even with things like bulk ordering or grants, sure, we could give more time, but maybe they shouldn't be grants. Maybe there should just be state money that is given to towns for them to fulfill the purposes they need to fulfill. And that's always an interesting piece for me. And I think one of the benefits of being a senator rather than a state representative is if there's something that's a grant process, I know it's probably, rather than just sort of an automatic delivery to towns, I know that's a situation where Brattleboro will benefit more than other communities. And so it's sort of against my town's best interest for me to push for something to not be a grant. It is absolutely in the state, like the majority of the state's best interest and Windham County's best interest probably for things to not be grants, because when something is a competitive grant, the 5 towns with real municipal capacity win out and the other towns don't. And so I think as we think about local control, I think we could also be having more conversations about what regionalism looks like in the face of, increasingly complex problems and increasingly limited volunteer capacity to solve those really complex problems. I don't think it's fair to our tiny towns to sort of leave all of those problems to them to figure out with a state, a rapidly sort of shrinking state apparatus. And sorry, I'm like really going on here, but I think
it's a really good point.
I think what it all comes down to is this idea that we keep on devolving control and fiscal responsibility without devolving power. And so, and that's sort of the problem that people, I think, keep on trying to solve by saying we need more local control. It's saying, like, we have all these problems that no one else is solving that we need to solve. We have people who are sort of pointing the finger at us. The bulk of our services are delivered at the local level, but we don't have any money or authority to solve these problems. Maybe the solution isn't actually to give the authority to solve the problem at the local level. Maybe the solution is actually just to solve the problem at an appropriate level to meet the need. And we're not doing that. And the feds certainly haven't done that for a long time. And they're maybe sort of trying to right now. But I think that a lot of this sort of like, Reagan era and post trickle down problem set, we keep on trying to solve like in the margins rather than trying to just like push back against the greater tide of it.
I think that's a very good point, Emilie. I think I'll just put it in a different way. When I've had conversations interviewing municipal folks, the way I hear it, what you just say kind of show up, I think, for them and Wendy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is, oh, look, the state just gave us another unfunded mandate.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
I think that's how it shows up for a lot of people in their understanding of what you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
How about for you, Wendy? What's resonating right now?
Yeah, a lot actually. A couple of things. It depends on what we're talking about. It's very difficult to speak in generalities and be accurate. To me, like say we talk about state roads. The state provides funding to the towns for maintenance of state roads.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fair amount of paperwork that goes along with that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily excessive, but I actually haven't been involved in all of that. But I think each system needs to be periodically looked at. And I think the idea of grants without strings that you were talking about, Emilie, I think that's a great idea. The federal government did that during COVID, both administrations, and it was tremendously impactful to individuals and to companies. I mean, the PPP grants ended up being, or they started out as loans, they ended up being grants. And in the old days, we had revenue sharing from the federal government to the municipalities, where they just sent you a check that was from general taxes, and then the municipality got to spend it how it wanted to, which is the ultimate local control, is control of income like that. So that's one point, is that we need to get into some level of detail when we're looking at solutions to problems. And then the variety of towns and municipalities is huge. So there are things that a Burlington, a Brattleboro, Barry can do that that smaller towns wouldn't want to do. So we could have classifications of towns in Vermont, and allow certain classes of towns to have more freedoms in specified areas. But we would just need to be very deliberate in those conversations, and not be too general, and not be too much in a rush either, and get the feedback from the towns. And there's always pluses and minuses to everything.
I appreciate what you just said about feedback from the towns, because I think a lot of the times when we're sort of chafing about authority in whatever piece of our life we're chafing about it, it's that the sort of voices of those most impacted are not heard. So it's that, sort of state rules about stop signs don't take into account the specific experience of Brattleboro and their stop signs, right? Or it's that state rules about how to deliver food stamp benefits don't take into account the way grocery stores operate in Danville or Athens, right? And so that's not necessarily a problem of scale, in as much it's a problem of the scale being unable to listen to those most impacted, which is that's a solvable problem, especially in a state that is smaller than most cities, right? This is not
right.
This is not a question of Rochester being subject to what Manhattan wants. This is there's just not that many of us. We could all have a conversation with each other. I don't know. Maybe that's so idealistic of me.
No, I agree with you. We just have to take our time too, and not be in too much of a rush, because process really matters in government, and that's intentional. That's one thing I learned at school, was that government has a lot of power. Government can take your liberty. Government can take your house. It's critical that government be open, that it be fair, and that it move at a slow enough amount, or a slow enough schedule that folks know what's going on and what comes about. Especially big decisions shouldn't be a surprise.
Right.
And folks who are impacted definitely need to be around the table, and have time to think about it. And then for really big decisions, I think you should revisit them a couple of years, 2 or 3 years after they're implemented, to see if they really are doing what you wanted them to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and have the intent be very clear. It's just deliberation is important.
Mm-hmm.
I like what you said about revisiting policy, because I think that's something we don't do very well. No. And things, once they get started, they just kind of like a snowball, they just keep going. Or I sometimes think of them as like a little Velcro dust bunny. They just keep picking up other things.
So sad, Olga. Like so sad. I like imagine like brilliant legislative ideas, and then like they get implemented and they get all dust. It's just like, but that's exactly what it is. And we don't, you know, I'm really curious if and when you win, Wendy, a seat in the Senate, how we can work together to follow up on things, because it's a huge problem that we don't ever revisit any of our solutions. And it's really interesting, especially when I go to national conferences of other state legislators, where we have, for a citizen legislature, a part-time citizen legislature, we actually spend more time in session than most. You know, there are some states that they're in session for 2 months a year, or in session every other year except for a month, or really pretty wildly limited time. But those states tend to have a lot more staff than we do. And so our policy committees really have like a very limited role to play in what I see as like basic government accountability functions. And a basic government accountability function is asking like, what is actually happening with this policy that we're already implementing? And so the only place that really tends to happen right now, from what I can see, is in our appropriations process. But they're doing it for the whole of state government, for the entire budget, and they're not the policy experts on those issues. And so it's not, there is definitely a better way to do it, to be revisiting those things. Sometimes we build in a report, but no one then actually has time to read the report, and there are no staff to read the report for you. And, you know, it becomes a joke within folks who have to write the reports that like, why are they writing the report? Because no one ever reads them. I do have some hope that the act of writing the report is like a meaningful reflection for the person who's implementing the program, but I've written enough reports to know that only happens in the very best of circumstances. So I don't know. Do you have ideas on this all, Wendy?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of your question. What were you saying?
Just, do you have ideas about all of?
Well, just I can comment. Sure. I sit on the transportation board of the state, and I've been on it since I think 2017. And what the board did when I was first on it was we actually went around the state and got folks' opinions on things. And so we did a report on public transportation and bus service, which can segue later into that another conversation. And it's supposed to, all of the reports were intended for the legislature, but I've asked legislators in the meantime if they even knew that we did reports, and they didn't, and it wasn't on our website. Now they are on our website, so if anyone's interested, there is a lot of support for public transit. But yeah, it's frustrating. So that was an example of when we did reports and nobody knew. And when I started looking at running, I wanted to know what the state did in the last session.
You wanted to know everything, Wendy, and I had so much respect for that. And also, I was like, "There's nowhere to learn these things."
I know, and that was so sad to me. And so the resources I had were reports put out by individual legislators, and VLCT, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, writes a summary, but it's based on what their interests are. So it's really a shame that the legislature doesn't have a summary of what it did. I mean, you should at least start there, and so you know what you did, and then you can go back a couple years later and say, hey, what happened? But that would just be a baseline, is to document what actually happened.
You know,
Yeah.
I even this summer I got to see a spreadsheet that Joint Fiscal Office keeps, which is even just like what happened that we have a responsibility for in the next 6 months. That it's like just their like task list, you know. But even to just see that was like more summative than most things I've been able to see. Because
That would be
it's
great.
like
Yeah.
legislators, I mean, like it wouldn't be useful to anyone else. It really was just like their to-do list. But I think, you know, we have the individual reports from legislators. Mine is absolutely just the things that I think are interesting, or I think my constituents will think were particularly interesting. If I did everything, it would like, you know, most people don't want to read that. And everything else is written by a lobbying group or an advocacy group, which are essentially the same thing, VLCT included. When I was trying to put together a housing summary in order to speak to the county housing coalition, I got reports from 4 different housing advocacy groups. And then the things I'd been tracking myself, I wove all 5 of them together. They all had different information and different stories about what happened. It was really wild.
That is fascinating. Well, as you and I dig into like what stories we tell ourselves and what stories create policy, that to me is fascinating. We are out of time for this first segment, so we're going to take a quick break to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. But stay tuned, we will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on BCTV, as well as many of the PEG stations around Vermont. Our Emilie's YouTube channel, our Facebook page, which is the Montpelier Happy Hour, as well as wherever you find your podcasts, and our webpage, which is the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm. Emilie, what do we need to remind people of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, and not the station, nor the platform, nor the employer of said people speaking.
Thank you. And if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, as well as Windham County Senate candidate Wendy Harrison. Thanks for being with us today, Wendy.
Thank you.
We're going to dive into transportation issues in a second, but before we do, so in the first half, we were talking about policy, and I used the phrase Velcro dust bunny. But Emilie, we haven't come up with a drink lately, so I think a Velcro dust bunny needs to be a cocktail.
No,
oh, yes, it does.
No one wants to drink that, Olga. No one.
Oh, come on. It's such a good name.
Oh.
See, this is the writer in me.
I don't want to sneeze too much.
I mean, I can see, like, I've been waiting tables at Tyne on Saturday nights, and so and like a lot of the drinks there have like sprinkles of things on the top that sort of like dissolve into the top surface of the cocktail, and I am just like so in love with the aesthetics of that, and I have a lot of ideas for how to do that with the Velcro dust bunny, but I also don't want to ever drink something like that. I think that sounds disgusting. So I don't know, but we do need to go back to the cocktail menu because we didn't do one this week.
It's happy hour, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm feeling left out.
Well, what's your favorite cocktail?
We're just riffing from here. So like if we were going to have a Velcro dust bunny to talk about the relationship between the state and towns, what would be in it? Like what would be the actual liquor mix?
Interesting.
I'm imagining there's like a sprinkle of black pepper on top, or maybe some squid ink. I don't know.
Yuck. It's served with a Kleenex. I don't want one.
It could be in an overfull martini glass so that like it sloshes as you serve it.
Maybe in the winter. It might be nice in the winter. In the summer, I don't think so.
Okay.
Something more light. Yeah. Colorful. Something blue.
I could see it.
Pink.
Yeah, like I was going to say blue or lavender because so many, like if you think of stuffed toys, so many bunnies come in like blue or lavender.
Yeah. That's funny.
Well, and then at the bottom of the glass, you could put little candied fruit or something like all. So it was an assortment of stuff because it's at the bottom of your purse or under your bed where you always have like this
Oh,
assortment of stuff. And
I
that to
like
me is
that.
like what policy when stuff just starts getting tacked on to different policies over the years. It's
Yes.
just
Oh,
an
that's
assortment
perfect.
of stuff.
So they're like both maraschino cherries and olives at the bottom.
Yeah, maybe.
Or mince, breath mince.
Terrible. Well done, though, Wendy. That was like spot on.
Very well done.
You're in the game now.
That's funny.
So segueing back to transportation, I'm looking forward to talking about this, Wendy, because one thing I always find interesting. A few years ago, I had to go through the DMV's website quite a bit for a number of reasons, but one phrase that kept coming up was driving in Vermont is a privilege. Having a license is a privilege, which is fine. But it kind of ticked me off every time because we live in a state where for so many people, if you don't have a car, you don't work, you don't get groceries, you don't do almost anything. And so for me, sometimes it doesn't feel like a privilege. It feels like a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just something I kind of keep thinking about. So for you with transportation, where has your focus been? And does that resonate with you at all about where we are with transportation, about what people would do without a car?
Yes, that is very car based. Our country is very car based generally. The U.S. is, and I can certainly empathize with what you're saying. I want to step back just one bit. Obviously, I've been out campaigning, and transportation, especially public transit, is a huge passion of mine. And I thought that when I moved to Vermont, I thought there wouldn't be an opportunity to advocate and work on public transit, but turns out there is. But I put it on my list of priorities, but I didn't highlight it intentionally because I didn't think other folks would be that interested. But I have found when I'm talking to people about housing, when I'm talking to people about access to jobs, access to training, access to school, transportation is often the second thing on that list. Like when you're talking about housing, there's affordability and then there's access. When you talk about jobs, there's the number of jobs, but then how do you get to the jobs? And so transportation really does impact so many things. And it turns out a lot of voters care about transportation too. So I was gratified to find that out. So relative to cars, I mean, we're always going to have auto transportation, just in the way that, we're a rural state. We have folks who live outside of the downtowns. And really what we need to do with cars is make them more efficient and make them less polluting. So EVs and carpools are good, are things that we need to encourage, and the state is doing that. The revenue for transportation over the last decade has really taken a hit because of gas taxes being the main source of revenue. So governments, federal and state, just don't have enough money to do what needs to be done. Vermont roads take need a lot of maintenance. And you can really see the differences in towns when you drive from town to town. You can see where the town line is, which is another area where towns can cooperate, but I won't go into that. So let me stop there just so I don't drone on.
I love what you said about road maintenance for two reasons. I just spent the last 2 weeks in Halifax at my cousin's house, and they're doing some work on 112. And when I first saw the work start, I'm like, 112 wasn't that bad. I don't know why they're doing maintenance. And then right now it's down to the grooved pavement where they've pulled off the top corners down to the grooved. And I'm driving along, I'm like, oh wow, the grooved pavement is so much better than even the original top coats. I'm like, okay.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, but and the town line is I think so brilliant because again, growing up right on the Mass border, like I did, Vermont Mass border, you could always tell like snowstorms. There would be a definite line of what had been salted and snow plowed and what hadn't, and what had been maintenance and what hadn't, and yeah, you always know when you're crossing into a new town without you don't need a sign on this road or anything. It's like boop.
Right. Totally. And some towns actually cooperate. Rockingham and Westminster do a good job of cooperating on this on areas where the towns overlap. But so then talking about cars, there are folks who don't have cars, but then there are people who don't want to have a car. Mm-hmm. And Vermont has wonderful opportunities for folks like that. The way that Vermont developed with the nodes of towns and being very centralized is perfect for walkable, bikeable transit communities.
What do you mean by nodes? Like village centers and stuff? Is that what you mean?
Right. But they're naturally here, like the downtowns. Brattleboro and Bellows Falls are perfect examples in our county of those. They're also on a train. They also each have a train station. So I met many people in Bellows Falls. One woman in particular was on a train trip which stopped in Bellows Falls. She lived in California. She decided to move to Bellows Falls because she got off the train there and thought it was so charming. And now she's very active in the community. So there are quite a few people who choose Vermont because it is walkable, and they don't want to be car bound for multiple reasons, environmental reasons, just their own health. Not everybody wants to drive, so we can foster that, and we should foster that, because we are going to get folks coming in to the state. We already have received climate refugees and political asylum seekers, and so we will be getting more people, and the better we can help them be in the nodes, if they want to be in the downtowns, that will be better for all of us, because then we'll reduce our carbon footprint, and we'll have access to jobs and schools and social activities and all of that.
So when I lived in Burlington, Wendy, I only drove once every 2 months or so. I rode my bicycle to the CSA to pick up my vegetables. I rode my bicycle to like the random front door that I was part of a raw milk co-op for. I took the kid on the bicycle to daycare. We really, and then there was this very vibrant cooperative taxi service if I needed to go to the airport, or there's nothing like any of that in Brattleboro even. So we're a node, but the train is totally useless to me. And I don't feel safe biking anywhere. And I really did. I biked in snowstorms. And I'm not a wimpy biker. With a toddler. I don't feel like I can bike here in Brattleboro. And so and sometimes it feels like there just isn't the economy of scale, even in Brattleboro, to put in that kind of bike infrastructure and taxi infrastructure that makes sort of the shared resources more possible. And so I just what will it take to have the train go 4 times a day instead of once a day so that it's actually useful to someone other than a tourist? And what does it take to actually put in meaningful bike infrastructure that feels safe to the people who are using it?
Right. No, it takes advocacy and money and time. So the biking, I agree with you. It's hard, primarily because of our narrow streets. Main Street, Main Street is for walking, in my opinion. And if you're brave, you can be a bike in between the log trucks, but that's very brave. But it's also short enough that you can park your bike and walk. There are bike lanes that are going to go up on High Street at exit 2. That'll go in, which will help a lot with the east-west route. But you're right, it's challenging to bike in Brattleboro. The best thing would be in my opinion, would be an off-street trail. And there are folks who have been talking about that. We talked about that when I was at Retreat Farm. But it's challenging. It's challenging to do. Stowe has a great one, but they have a lot of flat land. It's, part of it's the terrain too.
They also do things for tourists, which means that money gets freed up in a totally different way.
Yes. So then, but about trains, there is a second Amtrak train planned for this side of the state. The state just started the Ethan Allen service on the west side a couple weeks ago. So now they're going to turn their attention back to the east side. Extending the current service to Montreal is the first priority. Connecticut and Massachusetts are working on increasing frequency, and they have, it's either 4 trains coming to Greenfield daily now. And so, and the ridership is actually higher than they expected. And they want to extend those trips, some of those trips, up to Brattleboro and Bellows Falls, which would be amazing. So that would provide southern service. So folks here should actually check that out and ride those trains to keep it going. The taxi service is tough. There have been taxi services, and you're right, we don't have enough people, so that might need to be a subsidized service. The state is looking at different types of transit that operate more like an Uber. It's challenging. There are pilots going on, so we'll just have to be very deliberate too in those, like not give up too easily, but also not waste money. There's always that balance.
Yeah,
I'm hopeful.
That balance for me is always really interesting about things like, say, the post office, which is not a state issue, or public transportation, which, like, I'm always like, this doesn't need to cover its costs. It's just a public service. Like, if we assume that it's going to cover its costs, then we're going to wind up with, like, you have those, and I'm sure you understand this much better than I do, but it seems like there's sort of a diminishing return stuff where, like, you charge more, less people ride it, and then, or people ride it who, you're losing people who would ride it.
Right.
Say less people are riding it, so we should charge more. Like, it seems like there's a lot of catch-22s you get to.
Oh yeah. And for some services, or for some systems like the Burlington service, the revenue from fares is really important. For our service down here, the revenue for fares isn't that big of a component of the cost. I think what would be really helpful in our area would be if the buses ran later in the afternoon, later in the evening, because right now people can get to work, but then they can't go home.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you gain 2 rides if you had the buses run later. And this is something we talked about when we, the mover, when we did the changes in 2015, I think, or 2017, I think it was. We added the blue route to Brattleboro service. We talked about making, especially the train, it's the bus that runs between Brattleboro and Bellows Falls. We talked about having that run longer. A lot of folks wanted that. They wanted service on Sundays. So there is a threshold where once you increase the service enough, you get a lot more people riding. We also need good shelters, and people to wait. That's one thing Burlington has. They have really nice bus shelters because, it snows here, it rains here. It's just not reasonable to ask people to wait out in the rain.
So what does it take on this? So what should state government do, which the legislature be doing, in order to make sure that the incredible service that folks in Burlington might have access to, the later hours or good shelters, trickle over to these organizations that are run regionally that aren't actually state. Like, it's just another one of, I feel consistently frustrated with this strategy of Vermont government of having regional organizations that are not entirely instruments of the state, making sort of navigating these things on their own, and we do it with the regional transportation organizations. We do it with our mental health system, we do it all over the place.
Right.
But so what I think about it a lot in the context of our mental health system, what are the real deliverables we need to hold folks accountable to? And those regional partners need to be really clear about how much money it would actually cost them to do a good job. And I'm curious, in the context of the regional transportation, what are the sort of benchmarks we need to be holding transportation organizations to in order for them to actually do the job they need to do?
Right. That's a good question. There are benchmarks, and the federal government actually sets some of the benchmarks, but then the state adds to that. And I think we should establish a level of service and have at least a baseline level of service that would be in effect, throughout the state, because there are differentials in the service even in our area.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important. And then the other thing is how to integrate economic development in with this, because there are plenty of situations where employers are actually setting up their own systems to get people to work.
Really?
And that doesn't seem very efficient to me. Yeah. So, but to find out about these I'm haphazardly finding out about these things. So we need to get a better idea of the gaps in transportation and try to fill those gaps in a logical way so that too many people aren't spending money separately. That's something that we obviously should do collectively.
And circling back to sort of what we were saying before the break about what it means to sort of behave collectively in the state. There was recently an article somewhere about how Burlington's having this massive rat problem, and I think it's because of their compost situation. And I'm just remembering that. So Burlington doesn't even have municipal garbage pickup. It's separately contracted for each different. So you'll see 5 garbage trucks on the same freaking street in Burlington.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They don't have municipal, we're the only place in the state with municipal compost pickup. And if they implemented that their rat problem would go away. But that kind of,
Right. And I've seen other places where not having garbage service, especially in a dense area, it's a real health hazard.
Yes.
I saw that in one of the areas where people were actually storing garbage in their home because they didn't have a way to take it to the dump or to the transfer station, we should call it.
I think Olga's trying to jump in here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
you're fine. I'm loving this conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And so I just want to quickly say, Wendy, thank you for joining us today. Is there anything you want to leave listeners with before we head out?
Well, I am running for office. So if you're viewing this before November 8th, please vote for me and Nader Hashim. We're running as a team. We're the 2 Democratic candidates for Windham County State Senate, and we would appreciate your vote.
And how would people learn more about you or get in touch?
They could look at our websites, and we're going to be out and about. Probably our websites are the best thing, and I can give you 2 information.
What's your website
that you can post?
Okay.
Oh, you want
what's your website?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Mine is Wendy 4 WindhamVT.org, and I don't have Nader's in front of me, but I'm sure you can do a search. It's Nader Hashim, Hashim, and we will be all over the news, so you won't be able to miss us.
Thank you. Hey, Emilie, if people want to reach out to you, where can they do that?
folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, and there you'll find links to recent newsletters, all my socials, and then any contact information for whoever you might want to be in touch.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour will be back on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, at 2 p.m. on Friday, as well as all our online places to find us. So hope you will check us out, check out the podcast, check out the webpage, and have a good weekend, everyone. Take care.